I proposed to my brother's ex, but at dinner, he tested her love by proposing too. What happened next was unbelievable. Let me break it down.
First, some background.
I'm 28, my brother Mark is 26, and my fiancée, Jen, is also 26. Mark and Jen briefly dated last year, in August 2022. They lasted a grand total of 1 month before he got bored and ended things because he wasn't interested in commitment. At that time, I was living in another state, completely unaware of his love life, or Jen's existence, for that matter. Fast forward to October, when I moved back home. I met Jen at a bar one night, and honestly, she was everything I didn't even know I was looking for. Smart, stunning, and just a breath of fresh air. We clicked instantly. After a few amazing dates, we decided to make it official. By December, things were going so well that I felt ready to introduce her to my family during the holidays. Now, I'm not exactly the type to overshare about my relationships, so my family only knew the bare minimum about Jen until then. When I showed them her photo at Christmas dinner, they were impressed, until Mark saw it. He completely lost it, calling me every name in the book for dating his ex. He demanded I break up with her immediately. Naturally, I refused. When I asked Jen about it later, she confirmed their brief fling and explained how it ended. She was upfront and honest, and I believed her. After a couple of tense weeks, Mark seemed to drop it, and I assumed he'd moved on. Things took a turn on Jen's birthday this year. I planned a big dinner with our families and close friends, where I proposed to her. She said yes, and it was a beautiful moment, until Mark erupted again, yelling about how I had no right to propose to his ex. My sisters and I shut him down quickly, but the damage was done. Mark kept his distance after that, which was fine by me. Then, out of nowhere, he invited Jen and me to a family dinner at his apartment, along with our parents and sisters. I thought it was odd, but since the whole family was going, we agreed. The dinner itself was uneventful, but then Mark dropped a bombshell. Mid-conversation, he stood up and made some long-winded speech about how much he valued having us all there for his special moment. Before anyone could figure out what he was doing, he got down on one knee, pulled out a cheap ring, and proposed to Jen right in front of everyone. Jen was mortified. She told him to get up and put the ring away, but Mark doubled down. My dad tried to intervene, but I got to him first, by punching him. Things escalated, but honestly, I barely remember the details because I was so furious. Mark accused Jen of only being with me to get back at him and claimed he was trying to prove her true intentions. My parents hurried us out of there, promising to deal with Mark later. It's been a few days, and I'm still seething. I'm also worried this might make Jen second-guess our engagement. So, yeah, I could use some advice. Jen asked Mark to explain why he thought she had been hung up on him after their breakup. He claimed he'd heard rumors that she'd asked about him and kept frequenting the spots they used to visit together. To him, her showing up with me later only reinforced his suspicions. Jen, visibly annoyed, clarified that she'd only asked about him once after their split and had continued going to those places with her friends, places she had already enjoyed before they even started dating. She made it clear she wasn't going to give them up just because of a brief relationship. She then told Mark how offended she was by the idea that she would stoop so low as to pursue me simply to spite him. Mark barely shrugged, muttering a half-hearted apology, but tried to justify his actions by saying she needed to consider his perspective. He asked her if she truly hadn't realized we were brothers. Jen said it never crossed her mind since we didn't look much alike, and our personalities couldn't be more different. Mark conceded, mumbling an okay, and that pretty much ended the conversation. Before leaving, Mark informed me that I could take back his wedding invite because he couldn't support a relationship with someone he'd dated, no matter how briefly. I told him not to worry. He was already on the fast track to being uninvited. It felt like a necessary decision, even though my parents weren't thrilled about it. They understood it was a mutual choice, albeit a tough one. My sisters backed me up, saying they didn't blame me for not wanting Mark at the wedding. They saw through his antics and agreed he didn't have a valid reason for acting out. Since then, I've decided to limit contact with Mark, and honestly, I doubt he'll make much effort to reach out either. Now for an update. Things stayed quiet between Mark and me for a while. We only interacted during family events, and that was fine by me. But the peace didn't last long. My mom stirred things up again. The drama started at my younger sister Sophie's 22nd birthday party. At the end of the night, her boyfriend of 4 years proposed, and everyone gathered to talk about wedding plans. Sophie shared her ideas about a destination wedding, the perfect cake, and a dream dress. Then, out of nowhere, she joked, "I know Mark's banned from your wedding, Teddy, but you're okay with him coming to mine, right?" I laughed it off, telling her I had no say over her guest list, even if I wanted to. But my mom gave me this sharp look and asked if Mark was still uninvited from my wedding. When I said yes, she got visibly irritated. She accused me of being unreasonable and petty for holding a grudge, saying I was letting family drama ruin my big day. I reminded her that Mark and I mutually agreed he wouldn't attend, and this wasn't the time to discuss my wedding. The day was about Sophie, not our unresolved issues. Sophie backed me up, scolding my mom for trying to hijack her celebration. A few days later, my mom dropped by my house, determined to reopen the conversation. She pushed the narrative that uninviting Mark was a sign of insecurity over his brief relationship with Jen. I stood my ground, explaining, again, that Mark had agreed to step back. If he had a problem with it, he could talk to me himself. The argument escalated quickly. She threatened not to come to the wedding if Mark wasn't invited, claiming I was ostracizing her son. I shrugged and told her she could toss her invitation in the trash if that's what she wanted. I wouldn't beg her to attend. That didn't go over well. She accused me of dredging up her past mistakes to guilt-trip her, then stormed out. Since then, I've been bombarded with texts and calls from extended family on my mom's side, urging me to re-invite Mark for the sake of peace. Jen has also been on the receiving end of my mom's relentless messages, asking her to convince me to change my mind. To her credit, Jen hasn't engaged. Interestingly, when I talked to Mark about it, he seemed as fed up with the drama as I was. He reminded me that he uninvited himself and had no intention of attending anyway. He told me to leave him out of it and said he'd tell my mom the same thing. For now, I've gone low contact with my mom. My dad, thankfully, has been supportive and is still on good terms with me. I've told him I'm unlikely to reinvite my mom or her side of the family unless they change their attitudes, and even then, it's not guaranteed. He understands. Jen and I are now looking at downsizing the venue, as the guest list has shrunk considerably. And, in case you're wondering, my mom's decision not to attend has become official. About 2 weeks after declaring she wouldn't come, she showed up at our place unannounced, claiming she wanted to clear the air. Jen cooked dinner and made her a plate while I asked if she was still planning to skip the wedding. When my mom sat down to clear the air, she said she wanted to attend the wedding, but she couldn't get over the fact that I didn't invite Mark. She insisted it was all over what she called a simple mistake. I reminded her that Mark's so-called mistake was proposing to my fiancé right in front of me, with less than 3 feet between us. Her response? It was just a joke. Jen, ever the calm one, asked my mom why she even wanted to have this conversation if she wasn't willing to change her stance about Mark attending the wedding. That's when my mom admitted she wasn't there to talk to me. She came specifically to sway Jen. Apparently, she assumed I'd be at work and planned to catch Jen alone, hoping to convince her to talk me into inviting Mark again. Jen, polite as ever, told her she understood her perspective, but wouldn't have had that discussion without me present. After all, it involved my brother. My mom didn't take kindly to that and made a nasty comment about Jen being spineless and unable to think for herself without me. That set off a heated argument between the 3 of us. Jen eventually told her to leave, but the situation quickly spiraled. As Jen got up to unlock the front door, my mom followed her, shouting about how Jen was tearing our family apart. Then, out of nowhere, my mom grabbed Jen's hair, yanking her to the ground, all while screaming at her. She clawed at Jen's face and even hit her. I immediately stepped in, dragged my mom off her, and threw her outside. She pounded on the door for several minutes while I checked to make sure Jen was okay. Once my mom finally left, she started blowing up both our phones with calls and messages. I texted her to say she was permanently cut off from my life and told her not to contact me again. Afterward, I called my dad and sisters to let them know what had happened. My dad seemed shocked, trying to chalk it up to her being stressed over the whole situation. My sisters, on the other hand, weren't surprised at all. "She's always been crazy," one of them said, and they promised to come over to check on Jen. When Jen calmed down, I asked if she wanted to press charges, but she declined. All she wanted was to cut ties with my mom for good. I told her that was a given, but I still thought she should at least document the incident with the police in case something happened in the future. She was adamant about not having my mom arrested, though. Thankfully, my sisters and Jen's mom came over to comfort her, so she's doing okay for now. Still, I'm at a loss for what to do next. Jen doesn't want to involve the authorities, but my sisters and I feel like we should push her to reconsider, if only to protect herself in the future. Additional background. Some people have asked about my relationship with my parents and why things are so strained. Here's some context. Growing up, Mark was the golden child, my mom's baby boy, and she didn't exactly hide it. While my sisters and I were often left with babysitters, my parents would take Mark out shopping, buying him his favorite foods and toys. His clothes were always brand new and expensive, while ours came from thrift stores. And if we got gifts, they were things we had to share. Mark's stuff, though? Off limits. When Mark messed up, I got the blame. My mom insisted it was my job as the oldest to be a role model. For example, when Mark went through a phase of breaking his toys, I got punished for teaching him bad behavior. When Mark tried to push a kid down the stairs at school, I was grounded for 2 weeks and forced to apologize to the kid's parents for not being a better influence. At 13, I convinced my parents to let me earn an allowance by doing chores like mowing the lawn and taking out the trash. I got $25 a week. But when Mark saw me getting money, he begged my parents for an allowance too. Instead of making him work, they took $10 out of my allowance and handed it to him for doing absolutely nothing. Anytime I asked him to pitch in, his response was always, "It's not my job." By high school, I'd started distancing myself from Mark entirely. We barely spoke unless absolutely necessary. At 17, I got my first job, saved every penny, and bought my own car at 18. But even that wasn't safe from Mark. My parents asked me to let him use it for driving practice, and I reluctantly agreed. For a while, it worked out okay. He maintained the car and didn't abuse the privilege. But then Mark decided he wanted his own car, and my mom had the audacity to tell me to give mine to him because he needed it more. When I refused, she threatened to kick me out. After a huge fight, I was forced to transfer the car's ownership to Mark. I didn't have anywhere else to go, so I sucked it up and signed the papers. A few days later, it was officially his. The final straw came at my high school graduation. My parents didn't bother to show up because Mark didn't feel like sitting through the ceremony. That summed up my relationship with them perfectly. Mark always came first, no matter what. After I graduated, I barely had any support from my family. My mom didn't want to leave Mark alone for the night, so instead of celebrating, I only had my sisters, aunt, and uncle to lean on. They tried to make the night special by taking me out, but my parents insisted I come home for a dinner they prepared as an apology. The catch? My mom served shrimp and chicken on the same dish, knowing full well I'm allergic to shellfish. It was just another reminder of how little effort they ever made for me. That first year out of high school, I worked 2 jobs to save up for another car. When the new school year rolled around, I moved away for college and cut contact with my family entirely. For the first few months, they, mostly my mom, tried to reach out through social media and even through Sophie. I ignored every attempt, warning Sophie that if she kept pushing, I'd cut ties with her too. When Sophie couldn't get me to budge, my mom started trying to reach me through my older sister Charlotte and, occasionally, Maggie and Mark. I finally threatened to file a restraining order for harassment. It was an empty threat. I had no idea how to go about doing that, but it was enough to scare her off. After that, the most I got from her were hollow holiday texts over the years. Around the time I moved back to town, Charlotte told me that my parents had been attending family therapy at her request. She said they wanted to apologize for how they'd treated us growing up. I was skeptical but agreed to hear them out, on the condition that their apology was genuine. That marked the beginning of our reconciliation, but even now, it doesn't erase the years of damage they caused. When I met Jen, I wasn't sure where my relationship with her or my parents was headed. I avoided mentioning my family at all because I was fully prepared to cut contact again, if necessary. Jen understood it was a sensitive topic and didn't press for details, which I appreciated. Update 4. Moving forward. First, I want to thank everyone for the advice, support, and kind messages Jen and I have received. We've read through the comments together, and it's been a huge help in deciding how to move forward. To answer the most common question, why I even tried to reconnect with my family after everything, it was mostly for my sisters. Charlotte, in particular, wanted the whole family involved in her life when she had her first child. She didn't want her kid to grow up with part-time aunts and uncles who only showed up for birthdays and holidays. Charlotte rarely asked for anything, so when she asked me to try for her sake, I agreed. Part of me also hoped my parents might have changed. While they haven't entirely, I don't regret trying to reconcile. After all, if I hadn't, I wouldn't have met the love of my life. So, in a way, it worked out. After the incident with my mom assaulting Jen, we filed a police report. Jen didn't want to press charges, but we were told that the decision wasn't up to us. Still, the officers assured us they'd keep her preference in mind. We provided evidence of the assault, including photos of Jen's injuries and text messages between us and my parents about what happened. They advised us to document any future incidents with my mom in case things escalated. A few days later, my mom confronted me in the parking lot of my job. She was furious, screaming that I was ruining her life by reporting her to the police. She accused me of being a terrible son and demanded I fix the situation by telling the police to drop the report. When I refused, she had a tantrum right there in the lot and even hit me on the chest and arm. Security intervened and escorted her off the property. I had to explain everything to my boss, who was thankfully understanding. When I got home, I told Jen what had happened. She was understandably upset and suggested we reevaluate our plans with my family. After a long conversation, we decided to go completely no contact with everyone except my sisters. Jen also brought up the idea of moving away to put some physical distance between us and my family. She admitted she'd try to stay out of my family drama, but she refuses to tolerate my mom's abuse or my dad's enabling behavior. I agreed wholeheartedly. I also decided it was time to start therapy, and Jen is helping me find a therapist. I called my dad to let him know about our decision. When he didn't answer, I left a voicemail asking to have a serious talk. He called back later and asked if my mom could join the conversation. I reluctantly agreed, thinking she needed to hear what I had to say. The conversation went about as well as expected. I told them both that Jen and I were cutting them out of our lives permanently. My dad demanded to know why, especially after all the effort we'd put into mending our relationship. I told him the truth. This situation with Mark had shown me that nothing had actually been repaired. Their continued favoritism toward Mark and disregard for me had brought us to a point of no return. I made it clear that I was done holding on to a relationship that only served their interests. My mom cried, my dad got defensive, and neither of them truly acknowledged their role in any of this. But for the first time in my life, I didn't care. I told my parents that while I had agreed to reconcile for Charlotte's sake, I wouldn't continue to tolerate the disrespect toward me and Jen. For both our sakes, I was drawing the line. Turning to my mom specifically, I told her I was done being her scapegoat for her poor parenting and for Mark's entitled attitude. I made it clear I would never forgive her. Not for what she did to Jen, not for what she did to me, and not for what she put my sisters through growing up. She tried to counter, saying I should move on like my sisters had. I cut her off, telling her that she should focus on their forgiveness because she would never get mine. Not after everything she'd done, especially in the last few weeks. She started crying, asking how I could treat her like such a villain. My response was blunt. You can only be upset with yourself because I've done nothing wrong. Her tears quickly turned into an emotional outburst. She screamed that she regretted having me and accused me of trying to ruin her life. Jen stepped in at that point, unleashing a fiery response filled with much more colorful words than I would have used. She called my mom disgusting and hurled a few other well-deserved insults for saying something so vile to me. That shut my mom up. Whether she left the room or simply decided to stop talking, I don't know, but the tirade ended there. My dad, ever the enabler, chimed in, saying he didn't agree with being shut out of my life. He asked me to consider my mom's perspective, claiming she was struggling because her kids were at odds. He painted her as a victim, saying I was being unfair to punish her for her struggles as a parent. His final plea was about family. We're a family, and you shouldn't let past mistakes stop us from moving forward together. I wasn't having any of it. I told him that the only people my mom cared about were herself and Mark, and there was nothing he could say or do to make me change my mind. I ended the conversation by telling him he could choose to keep my number if he wanted, but I would be blocking him and my mom on everything. I wouldn't be reaching out again. Then I hung up. After the call, I wrote a long email to my extended family. I included links to my earlier posts, laying out everything that had happened, and officially uninvited everyone except my sisters, aunt, and uncle from the wedding. Writing that email hit me harder than I expected. I hadn't cried in years, but Jen held me while I let it out. She reassured me that we would be okay, and for the first time in a while, I believed her. My sisters reached out after reading the email. I apologized to Charlotte for not being able to keep reconciling with our parents as she'd hoped, but she told me it was okay and understood why I had to cut them off again. The response from the rest of my family was mixed. Some were furious that I aired our private issues online, while others were angry at my parents, saying they had no idea things were this bad. Mark reached out shortly after everything went down. He asked if I was cutting him off, too. I told him no, but I wouldn't be making any effort to maintain contact either. He didn't argue and simply wished me the best. We haven't spoken since. Jen and I decided to move closer to her brother, who lives about 3 hours away in a city we both like. I talked to my boss about transferring, and Jen has been looking into remote work options or possibly finding a new job. With a smaller guest list, her brother offered to let us use his lake house for the wedding, which was a perfect fit. Now for some happy news. I'm a husband and a father. Jen and I found out she was pregnant around the time of my last post, which motivated us to kick things into overdrive. We moved, settled into a new place, and got married 4 months ago at her brother's lake house. The ceremony was small, with mostly her family and my sisters, aunt, and uncle in attendance. It was simple, intimate, and easily one of the best days of my life. Last month, we welcomed our daughter into the world. She's beautiful, healthy, and perfect. Jen had a rough pregnancy, both physically and emotionally, but since giving birth, she's been doing much better. She's under close medical care due to some complications, but thankfully, there aren't any major health concerns. Even with the doctor's visits, I haven't seen her this happy in a long time. Unsurprisingly, my mom couldn't stay away. Shortly after the wedding, she created a fake Facebook account to bombard Jen and me with messages. She ranted about being excluded from the wedding and pregnancy, claiming she was entitled to be part of her grandchild's life. She even demanded to visit us or have us visit her and had the audacity to ask to be in the delivery room. I shut her down immediately. I screenshotted everything and emailed it to myself in case I need it for a restraining order in the future. Then I blocked her. From what I've heard, she's been harassing my sisters, trying to get them to talk to me on her behalf. I made it clear to them that we have nothing left to discuss. Mark called after Jen and I returned from our honeymoon. He congratulated us on the wedding and the baby. We had a long talk about everything that happened. He offered what felt like a sincere apology to both me and Jen. Since then, we've exchanged the occasional text, small talk, and life updates. He invited me out for a drink next time I'm in town. I told him I'd think about it, though I doubt I'll take him up on it. One thing's for sure. Mark doesn't know where we live, and he likely never will. Even if we manage to rebuild some kind of relationship, I'll never fully trust him, especially when it comes to my parents. Thank you all for your support throughout this journey. It's been a whirlwind, but I'm finally in a place where I can focus on my wife, my daughter, and our future. I don't plan to post any more updates unless something major happens, but for now, life is good. Happy holidays, and thank you again.